We are 1 month into 2025, but I think it is worthwhile reflecting on the year that was 2024. Globally, we found that almost half the world's population headed to the polls, and we were no stranger to the ballot boxes here in South Africa as our national elections dominated the headlines. There was a surprising outcome in the ANC losing their outright majority, but the formation of the Government of National Unity, or GNU, or the GNU, was market positive, and we saw a rally in our bond and equity markets. It was a clear illustration of economic fortunes being closely tied to political outcomes. Now, as positive sentiment starts to roll off, and bearing in mind that the GNU is largely untested, the real question is, are we focusing enough on the underlying fundamentals, such as national debt and how to get the economy growing? So if we start off with something like national debt, we look at our government debt to GDP, which has ballooned to more than 75%. And with a large debt load, it comes with increasing debt servicing costs, costs that are crowding out other government expenditure, like healthcare and education. Not only that, we're also seeing that the private sector has reduced investment. Now in 2024, we accessed 100 billion rand from our gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account, or JFECRA. And even though this provided relief to our fiscus, this is not a lever that we can readily pull. And so it becomes vital for National Treasury to hold the line when it comes to government spending. Now, you can't talk about debt without thinking about inflation. And inflation has moderated in South Africa, which has allowed us to enter our rate-cutting cycle. Some may argue that the real interest rate at a 19-year high may warrant more aggressive rate cuts. But the South African Reserve Bank has been quite prudent on their rate cuts, citing higher local water and electricity tariffs for the year. That being said, we aren't fully insulated from the global picture, where we're starting to see that inflation is proving to be quite sticky. And so the long-term drivers of inflation are very much in play, and maybe a more cautious stance is warranted. If we look at economic growth, two valuable indicators of future economic performance are unemployment and the gross fixed capital formation. In South Africa, if we look at our scorecard, unemployment is now at about 32%, and our gross fixed capital formation, or investment in fixed assets, this will include machinery, land improvements, factories, is rather lackluster. And so much work needs to be done in order to get our house in order if we can hope to surpass the 1 to 2% growth that has been penciled in for 2025. And so, beyond the positive inflection point of the formation of the GNU, the question is, how do we get sustainable economic growth that translates into a multi-year recovery? I'm joined today by Sandy McGregor and Nazmeera Moola, who will discuss their views and provide further insights.
Thank you, Horacia. Naz, to start with, I think we should discuss South Africa in a global context, because everything that happens here is in a way determined to a high degree by what happens elsewhere. And when people looking at what in the international situation now affects us, a lot of people focus on America and Trump. But in fact, for me, the most important single thing is what's going on in China. And specifically, the Chinese, having spent the last 7 years heavily investing in their industrial infrastructure, is flooding the world with goods. And this is having an alarming effect on developing countries. Europe and America will protect themselves with tariffs, but we are in a much more difficult space. And we're already seeing, things like ArcelorMittal having to close their steel works. China exported 100 million tons of steel last year. They had $1 trillion trade surplus. And now our car industry is under a lot of pressure from Chinese imports. In this environment, can we actually really grow? What is the impact of this on our sort of economic growth and our ability to handle that?
Sandy, I think you highlight exactly my biggest concern. Is, we focus on the US because the US determines capital flows to emerging markets to a large degree. But in terms of our local industrial policy, in terms of the hollowing out of our economy, that's going to be driven much more by China. And what we're seeing right now is, in addition to the steel point you make, the auto point, where if I think I didn't pay attention to cars for about 5 or 6 years, and I suddenly looked up, and half the cars on the road seem to be Chinese brands nowadays. There's been a massive shift in the mix of brands on the South African roads at this point in time. But the third area that's really started to worry me is the retail space. That's been a big bulwark of South African growth over a long period. The consumer tends to spend when it has money. And now you are seeing South African retailers lose market share to the likes of Shein and Temu. And there doesn't seem to be any response from the government on that, because I think they're trying to figure out how to deal with that situation.
So does this mean that really the only areas we are competitive perhaps are commodity exports, maybe agriculture? I think one of the remarkable things about South Africa is how when we have not blessed with a great sort of climate or resources, how well our farmers do. So the agriculture, I think, has been the one area of our economy that has really grown in the last decade. And tourism, you can see us having opportunities there, but are there opportunities anywhere else? I'm not so sure.
I think there are going to be niche opportunities elsewhere. So, as you say, we pay our way in the world in commodities, and therefore the outlook for the commodity cycle matters a great deal. The fact that China has shifted to this industrial policy as opposed to infrastructure development means that demand for commodities is perhaps more sluggish. But I think over the medium term, the investment that you're seeing globally in the energy transition, I know Trump doesn't believe in climate change, but a lot of red states are benefiting from energy transition investment, will still support commodity prices. I think what we're also going to see some support from in South Africa is if you start to see investment in the electricity infrastructure, in the transport infrastructure, that will also support growth. But from a supply side basis, it is becoming more difficult. Tourism is one area that I think if you're Cape Townian, you probably think is over-demanded at this point. But that is an area that could see further growth. And what I would hope, I'm not betting on it yet, I'm interested in your thoughts on the ability of the GNU to positively impact other municipalities. But what I would hope is that you start to see a resuscitation in municipalities in other parts of the country, because there's a lot of South Africa that could benefit from tourism.
It's interesting what you say, because generally a lot of what we call growth is actually fixing what is broken.
Yes.
It's a funny thing that in the economics is if you break something, then repair it, that's considered economic growth, whereas actually it's trying to stand still. But that's the way people do it, so who are we to criticize it?
Well, the depreciation is implicit in the GDP calculation as well.
Yes, but it never really reflects the reality.
That's fair.
And but this really then comes back to the issue of the GNU, as I prefer to say, coalition, because I don't think it is a national unity so much as a coalition of two, in the main, two parties who now got together.
Don't forget, it's more than two parties.
They will.
They're at pains to tell us that it's more than two
to
parties.
tell us that, but in fact the reality is that two parties do really matter. The others are sort of passengers. And no, when the GNU, when you think last year, before the election, you could ask people's time horizon. You could say it was 1 month. Now it could be 5 years, and that, of course, has had a dramatic impact on the financial markets. The bond markets strengthened, and generally business confidence is massively better than it was a year ago. But the big question is this thing going to hold together? Do you think it is? We can think of it lasting 5 years. What are the risks to the GNU stability?
I'm actually pretty optimistic that it lasts the distance. Mainly because I think the self-interest of the two main parties aligns with it lasting the distance. So I'm not claiming that there is altruism involved here. I think it's very much self-interest in that the difficulty for the Democratic Alliance as the junior partner in the coalition is that global evidence shows us that the junior partner very rarely benefits long-term from having been part of the alliance. So from their perspective, they are massively incentivized to show that their participation has had material difference in the areas that they have control over. And we started to see that in the likes of Home Affairs. From the ANC's perspective, they're in a rebuild mode, or that's their plan. And they need the time to let that play out. So I think that my bet is it goes the distance. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the same thing, because but I think it depends very much how the ANC plays the national health card. Because I believe, the thing of language policy in schools affects one constituency in the DA, which is the Afrikaner. Mm-hmm. But the national health thing affects every member of the DA. Is they all on the same page on that? And perhaps that is the one issue which, if it is to break the GNU, that is the one which could do it. And but I think the president is in fact brilliant at kicking cans down roads. He has done that in his entire political career. And if it was Olympic Games and kicking down roads, he'd get gold medals. So I think he might well manage this process. The other thing, so that would be
maybe we can use a different analogy. You can keep the stone rolling.
Keep the stone rolling.
That's a more positive analogy than can kick.
All right, I'll cancel that. I think that's the more positive things. Of course, the other thing that affects it is whether I think the ANC itself, there's a considerable constituency in the ANC which is nervous about the coalition. And does the coalition survive actually the ANC's next party conference and election of a new leader? That's the other intriguing.
Is nervous the right word?
Nervous about the coalition? Yes, well, they're hostile to it. Actually, there's a groups of people.
That's why I was asking. Nervous sounds a little bit
weak.
Weak.
Yes. No, it's hostile.
There is hostility. There was definitely a constituency in the ANC that would have preferred another option.
Yeah.
What is interesting is the heart of that other option, namely the EFF, has weakened considerably since the election.
As has MK, it seems.
As has MK on the face of it. I mean, I think I personally feel like I don't have enough understanding of that party to make clear, definitive statements.
I think that's true of everyone.
But I'm happy to admit it. So I think there is a power struggle that's going to play out in the ANC. And I think that that will be determined by what happens in the growth dynamic. So if South Africa manages to improve its growth rates, Horacia's talking about moving beyond the 1 to 2% penciled in for this year. If South Africa can get beyond that by the end of the year into next year, because you start to see the investment in infrastructure happening and therefore business investment as people's time horizons extend, that will be much more supportive of the ANC constituents that are broadly aligned to Cyril Ramaphosa retaining control into the next cycle.
I suppose the other the constituency which in the ANC which is important is all the people who have benefited from the old order of corruption, let's say. There is presumably less opportunity in this new system to carry on the practices of the old. And would that be an issue here, that in fact the beneficiaries of the old order, which came to an end with the coalition, do you think they would reject to it, or who in the ANC would be against this?
Do I get to ask you the question as well?
Yes.
I think we are all very aware as South Africans that corruption has stolen an enormous amount of money out of the fiscus and state-owned enterprises since 2010. I don't think anyone is able to deny that. I mean, the Zondo Commission put plenty of evidence on the table around that. And I think if you're in a situation where the fiscus is much more constrained, where there's much more transparency, and where you have certain departments being run by members of the opposition, I think those gaps have closed considerably. But are there still gaps available? Of course.
Yeah, and I think it's local government especially. In a way, you can control it at the centre with better procurement processes. But the major problem, I think, is the way local governments are run. And the people who are running local governments depend on their salaries. It's a major part of patronage in the ANC is local government positions. And the extent that, for instance, that you lose control of local governments, it becomes a major issue for the parties. And I see that is the difficulty, is that corruption is not just at the middle, at the centre. It sort of proliferates right through the economy in local government. And that is where I think the real problems of corruption, of the price of corruption is paid.
Because that's the bit of the government that touches most people.
Yes.
That's the bit that supplies the water, the roads, the actual day-to-day living experience.
I battle to see how you fix that, because I know they talk about parachuting sort of competent managers into municipal structures to try and fix it, but so far there's not been. I think in Durban there has been, that has happened, hasn't it?
There seems to be incremental positive change. There definitely seems to be a move in the right direction there, but I think it's early days.
Yeah. And the big price problem will come on water. That's where I suspect the biggest single crisis we have in South Africa this year is water in Johannesburg and in Gauteng generally. It's
in Gauteng, in parts of eThekwini. I mean, I have
yes.
a cousin in Umhlanga who has water blackouts on a semi-regular basis because the reservoir that supplies her specific streets has issues. So I think that is definitely an issue. And I think maybe one point to note on corruption is we always think about corruption as the cost being the money that's taken. But actually, from some of the experiences I've had, one of the biggest costs is the loss of good people. Because good people don't stay around.
Yeah, that is actually at the heart of all our problems is a skills situation.
Yeah.
We haven't been able in the last few decades to develop a skilled cadre of public servants to replace the ones that sort of got. In 1994, there were a lot of ANC cadres who came back from abroad who were highly educated and had certain skills, and that whole base of skilled people has been seriously eroded in the last decade, especially.
But it goes back to the corruption issue.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing is you have an environment where the good, talented people don't want to go.
Yes, and they all want to go in the private sector.
Want to go
There's
into
more
the
money,
private sector,
and
more
less
money
grief.
and less hassle.
Yes.
And that's what we need to change. So we go back to the GNU. What is one tangible positive that could come out of a government that stays the distance, is having that certainty in ministries, certainty of policy, and a focus on delivery means that actually young, talented people stick around.
Yes, and I think the coalition is in a better position now than the previous governments to reskill the bureaucracy.
Yes.
And that's
completely
really,
agree.
Fixing South Africa starts with reskilling the bureaucracy.
So, Sandy, I'm going to date you and me now, but we first met in 2000. And I was working for a gentleman at Merrill Lynch at the time called Joss Gerson. And I remember the first time I think we took you for lunch. We were brokers. We could do that back then. Took you for lunch. And you both spent most of lunch talking about the skills shortage in South Africa.
What's
Fast
changed?
forward 24 years. And what are we talking about? The skills shortage in South Africa, which is now even worse than it used to be.
Yeah. And it's one of those, the trouble is, it's one of those things that you can fix in a generation. It's very difficult to fix it fast. And that's the biggest.
It's true, but I think reskilling the bureaucracy selectively, not the broad.
There are a lot of good people in the bureaucracy, I think, who are not being used properly too.
Exactly. So my sister, for her sins in life, works for Eskom. And she will say that there are many really good people who've stuck around that are being given more space now.
Yes. And I think that's the notable achievement at Eskom in the last year, is getting all the people there working better together.
Yeah.
I think that's why it's going better there.
I think that's definitely the case.
Yeah.
But again, so Eskom, let's use Eskom as an example of how you have policy coherency in terms of what we're going to do with electricity generation. And then you have leadership that is competent, has the trust of both the employees and the shareholder, and you manage to have some execution.
Yeah, because the interesting thing about Eskom is I think De Ruyter's main achievement was setting out a path which we should follow. And it's been a very clear path, and no one disputes that path. And the achievement of his successors has been to actually start implementing that path, slower than we'd all like, but still we're set on that path. Can we say that Transnet, I think, is going through the same process, that maybe the path is more complicated, but we are, I think the change in management in Transnet has been transformative. Would you agree with that? I think it's the key change they made.
Definitely.
And
I think you have leadership in place now that's experienced, that's practical, that's pragmatic, that's dealing with the issues. I think Transnet's problem right now is that it has a balance sheet structure that's ultimately unsustainable. But it has a shareholder that's been really badly burnt by the recapitalization of Eskom and not yielding the benefits expected quickly enough. And so the appetite from National Treasury to facilitate a similar sort of recap for Transnet is very low.
And unfortunately, probably that is the only way you're going to go forward, because as long as it can't it has to transfer all its resources to funding its debt. Mm-hmm. It cannot really get itself out of the hole. They have to take the plunge and do exactly what they did with Eskom. Is in effect the whole liability, all the liability of Transnet must be shifted to the state, which of course, as you say, correctly, the Treasury is totally opposed to for very good reasons, which I think comes back to the key thing in government, of course, is the coalition, of course, is that the Treasury is taking a very hard line on expenditures. So all the departments are really being frustrated by not having enough money to do what they do. For instance, our Minister of Home Affairs, who come into thing and he say, well, the Treasury doesn't give us enough money to fix home affairs. And it sounds so familiar, story which most, but I think the competent ministers say that because they do what they can with the resources they've got. But in fact, really to get going, you've got to spend more money. And how do you see the fiscal situation evolving in this next few years? Is the coalition going to accept you've got to spend more money, which you can't, we haven't got the money to spend, and after all, as Horacia was saying, the Jafekra 100 billion it's wonderful it came when it did because it allowed the coalition government to actually get its first year without any financial problems really. So it was a very fortunate policy change to raid the reserves as they did. But it's not you can't go on doing that indefinitely. So we have a funding problem. We have the Treasury trying to hold the line with and things like in the health system, they can't appoint people to posts that are needed because there isn't the money to do so. And same in education. So does the coalition hold the line with the Treasury? This is, I think, the big political debate which has to be happening right now.
I think that's the difficulty, and I think the budget that's coming in a month's time, or less than a month now, I would expect that you see them holding the line there. I think that that's very much base level policy right now, because what we're talking about is a more nuanced discussion that's going to take a little bit longer to process. Does Home Affairs need a significant investment in computer systems? Yes. How do we go about creating space for that is what they need to figure out. So I think eventually, which means like let's fast forward 18 months, maybe as soon as the MTBPS this year, is we are going to have to create room for specific investments. I mean, on Jafekra, I mean, it's not a never-ending supply, but there is probably a little bit more money in the kitty to facilitate infrastructure.
Yeah, they're saying 25 billion a year or something.
25 billion a year, which you can start to do something with, but it's not enough. I mean, the Minister of Home Affairs wants 20 billion rands just for his computer system. Last I heard, I may have the number wrong, but it's there or thereabouts. So I think we are going to need to acknowledge the fact that we need to make select investment in areas that cannot be done by the private sector. There are portions that they can do private-public partnerships, and I think that's going to be where Transnet's going to have to start, and they've already started laying the groundwork for that. But there are portions that can't be done that way.
Yes, so this is, I think, the real problem. I think people often think the private sector can solve a lot of problems in government, which it can't. Now, look at Transnet, for instance. There's if you had a totally private railway system, you'd be different. But you've got to then take Transnet as a whole, and privatize it and make it a private company listed on the stock exchange. I know who'd buy the shares at the moment. But and really take the big bang approach and make it totally private. But that seems to be politically unacceptable. So, but these partial privatizations, which everyone favours, very often actually get so complicated that they don't solve the problem. And the other thing is that to privatize, you need a revenue stream. It's the interesting thing about spinning off the transmission system. To do that, you've got to decide how much revenue does the transmission company have. And we haven't yet seemed to have determined that. And
well, the transmission company, let's start with the fact that they instituted a reorganization that seemed to be most beneficial for the advisors involved than for the entity.
Yes.
Because you've created a transmission entity which is unfinanceable by itself because it's still beholden with these upward guarantees into the parent for the debt, which they need to resolve that.
You need
one.
to create
a balance sheet
balance sheet.
Balance sheet that makes sense, and then the second issue becomes yours.
A revenue stream.
Revenue stream.
You need a revenue stream, you see. And a lot of these privatizations, the revenue stream is actually where it runs wrong. You can, if you want to privatize a hospital, for instance, you've got to have a revenue stream.
Mm-hmm.
The system isn't geared up to it. If you want to privatize water facilities, you've got to create a revenue stream. And it's being able to provide those revenue streams. And we've seen actually in the toll disaster in Gauteng,
mm-hmm.
that there they had a revenue stream. But the point is that very often then it becomes the service being provided in a poor country becomes unaffordable. And that is really what blew up the tolling. It became unaffordable for the citizens of Johannesburg, and so they went on the rampage. It was a sort of middle-class rampage, which actually succeeded.
Also, I think you could argue that for me at that point, it was less about affordability and more about general dissatisfaction with poor service delivery, and this was something they could actually attack.
Yeah.
On the electricity side, there are successful models in the world where transmission has a revenue stream attached to it.
Mm.
So we're not starting from scratch. And the toll roads that were done in the late 90s...
They're working all right.
They work fantastically. That is the blueprint.
Yeah.
So how do we take that and use that to make transmission viable? The difficulty is that in this very complicated NERSA revenue calculation that Eskom relies on, where, fun fact, which I'm sure you know, but everyone watching this may not know, the way the NERSA tariff formula works is they come up with a quantum of revenue that Eskom should have. And therefore, if they're selling less electricity, it allows them to push the price up more to get to the quantum. Anyway, let's park that interesting regulatory rabbit hole for a second and go back to, if we're creating a revenue stream for transmission, the difficulty is you're going to be taking money away from the parent company at this point, because they have effectively been cross-subsidizing generations' debts with transmission revenues.
In fact, they haven't charged for transmission correctly.
There's that as well.
And this is what my big worry about the transmission company is, that rolling it out is going to take far longer than we think. And so again, therefore, the renewable rollout will not be as fast as we think. And it's just all these things are going to take far longer. And so where you'd hope it'd be 1 year, it's going to be 2 or 3 years, in which case the burden on growth of fixing of the parastatals building things is going to be a more pernicious problem for longer than I think many of us hoped. But that's probably the likely outcome.
It also depends how we approach it. So, for example, Anglo-American's being really interesting in that they are starting, not starting, a portion of their renewables is going to be located in Mpumalanga.
Mm.
So we know South Africa's best resource is the Northern Cape, the wind and solar, but Mpumalanga, relative to the rest of the world, is still a good resource. It's certainly better than most of Europe.
And of course it's connected into the transmission system.
Exactly. You have the grid collections.
And that's where you've got to invest your renewable.
And so there is this trade-off being made, which is we know where the best option is, but they're pretty good options much closer to the grid connections. And then what you have is that there are projects that are already being executed where the grid connection is imputed into the tariff as well.
And so I think electricity, we're starting to see it being fixed. It's starting to be fixed.
And we've had 3 years since that ridiculous 1 megawatt ceiling, self-generation ceiling was lifted. So there's been a lot of work that's gone into it. Your point around 2 to 3 years, I think we're far down that on electricity.
Yes.
So the workarounds to the dysfunctionality in certain areas are already being developed. I think the problem is in rail, it's still much earlier. So how do we have a situation, Trump's creating another window of opportunity to export coal. So, as much as I'm terrified for my daughter's future in the climate, let's, take the shorter term gains here. But Richards Bay Coal Terminal does not allow for that.
And it's the rail. If you could get, Richards Bay can export 90 million tons. We can't. We're only getting 60 million tons to the port. And we could sell that 90.
Completely.
We could produce and sell another 30 million tons of coal if we could transport it.
Yes.
And the other thing, we've got to get all the stuff off the road onto rail, because it's the cost of road transport in terms of road maintenance is an externality which is just not provided for.
So I think what we're discussing is all the obstacles. The good news is that the delta is positive. Electricity firmly so, transport I think will incrementally be so. So the big question for me becomes, when do we start seeing this translate into private sector investment? Because you made a really important point earlier when you said prior to May last year, the average business person's time horizon was 1 month at most, because they had no idea what was going to happen. And now we have a situation where business people are starting to take a longer term horizon. South Africa, from an investment point of view, certainly for portfolio investors, it seems to be flavour of the month. I mean, if you talk to any of the sell side at this point.
We're the safe haven now.
Yes, apparently South Africa is a safe haven. They're inundated with foreign investors coming down to South Africa. So when do you see this translating into South African businesses making investment decisions?
Yeah, and this for me is the problem with making an investment decision, is that people make an investment decision if they can see a market. And if you don't see a market, you don't make it. A lot of people think we must provide money for people to invest. That's not how it works. Someone says, I can see an opportunity somewhere, and then they start looking for money and resources to develop that opportunity. And so then having the availability of funding becomes significant. But the key thing to start a business is you need a market. And you look at South Africa now, and people's incomes are not growing in real terms. The last 3 years, I think, incomes have been static in real terms. And that, in fact, is worse than that, because, in fact, people at the top on bigger salaries actually continue to do better off. And so people at the lower down in the salary scale actually are going backwards.
Are you offering to take a pay cut?
Yes, not paid very much, so whatever's left now. But no, that's the reality. Is that it's a global reality? I mean, everywhere in the world, there's this simple dynamic of the modern economic model. It favours people with better skills, better education.
Yep.
And that is a very real. Our huge unemployment problem starts with that simple reality of the modern economy. But if you're looking for a market and you say your domestic market is not growing really because of this problem that we aren't increasing, people not getting better off, and then you say, well, then you've got to export and find a foreign market, which China's doing by killing everyone else.
Yeah.
And this is the biggest problem we have, is that we've got to find find markets for people to invest to meet. And I don't think the mining industry is going to be able to do that. People forget South Africa's been mining for 150 years or something, and we've dug a lot of it out. The real easy wins have all been made in this thing. So we do have good platinum resources. We have chrome and vanadium, and manganese, but really, there are not a lot of opportunities really in the mining sector. There are some that do exist, but there are things that can be done, but it's not enough to get the economy going. And so you've got to find other places to invest in. This I do think tourism comes back to, as we were saying earlier, this the one area which perhaps you can see a big opportunity. But this is the biggest dilemma we face, is finding a market. Fixing the infrastructure is the start of having having an economy where you can actually start producing things. And that's why fixing the infrastructure has to be the priority?
I think fixing the infrastructure, and if over the next 5 years you continue to see progress in the technologies around the energy transition, our neighbour to the northwest of us, to remember which side's west for a sec, has put a lot of work into developing an industrial plan around that. And they are certainly looking to partner with the likes of South Africa there. So I think there are opportunities that could open up. I mean, I take your point, and you are very much the experts in the mining industry, so I understand I'm on shaky ground here. But I would argue that Australia's been mining for as long as us, and they've managed to find new deposits and take advantage of some of the new energy transition metals.
They
Whereas
have
you
a
look
lot
at the
of
mapping in South Africa, and I don't think we've done any real exploration for 20 years.
No, the mining law has prevented
Completely.
exploration. And the way you explore for now is under the areas which are below sand, so to speak, which you can't find easily. So things that are at greater depths than on the surface, which are hidden. So I'm sure there are things you can find. That's no doubt. But it's a long-term game. And as I say, the immediate, one forgets how huge our mining industry has been. It's shrinking. And keeping it going at current levels is going to require considerable investment.
So I think mining is something we would benefit from more policy stability and environment. But maybe if we turn to the shorter term a little bit and think about growth in the next 12 months, that is an area the Reserve Bank has an ability to influence. They may not be able to shift structural growth rates or potential growth rates, as the governor tells us repeatedly, but they can certainly influence shorter term growth.
So what you're saying, they should reduce rates?
I don't think they should be irresponsible about it, but I think personally they are being overly conservative and cautious at this point in time.
Yeah, I think, this is an interesting topic because Jay Powell has twice used the word recalibrate. He used it in 2019 when they they cut rates all of a sudden quite a bit, saying basically the rate structure is too high, we must go down to a lower level. And he used it again last year when he cut rates by 50 basis points. And the argument of recalibration is one looks at the overall rate structure and say it is generally too high because every day you make a decision, you do it against where you start from. So if you start too high and come down by a quarter, you're still too high. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. And I remember when Ian Plenderleith came deputy governor of the Reserve Bank in the early years,
this
2000.
Like 2003 or so.
And I knew him from his previous life, and he asked me, well, what do I do? And I said, rates are crazily too high. And he looked at it, and he came back and he said, that's right. And everyone agreed. I wasn't the only one saying this. And the Reserve Bank had got stuck in a much higher rate structure than they were, and because they were always thinking in terms of that rate structure, all the policy makers within the framework. So what we need to have a very serious thought about what is an appropriate rate in South Africa. And I think the big opportunity comes to us with this debate about lower the inflation target. Now, I'm not sure that monetary policy does. I'm a bit sceptical of the ability of monetary policy to manage the inflation rate, but lower inflation rates have a huge effect on monetary policy, and it gives freedom in monetary policy. And given the deflationary effects of China, the one thing that I think in the next year or two, with China flooding the world with goods, is we're going to have a global environment with very low inflation. There'll be inflation in America as Trump's tariffs, put up the inflation rate. But for the rest of the world, in Europe, in all the emerging markets, inflation will be very low. So when you have a background of low inflation, we can actually, in South Africa, have fairly low inflation rates. And therefore talk of, say, 3% inflation as the norm, for instance, is not impossible in this environment, especially as we have the correct monetary policy. You can't say our monetary policy is inflationary. One can say that monetary policy can't fix inflation, but without correct monetary policy, you'll never get low inflation. And that's what we have now. We have correct policy there. And as the economy gets more, some of the things like Transnet and Eskom are going up rather than down, you're starting to create an environment where inflation could be very much lower than people have been used to. And that creates an environment where interest rates can be lower. And then you can then recalibrate and come down. What's your take on that analysis?
I don't think I disagree massively. I think it's all interconnected. So we start off with a global environment that is likely to be deflationary, a local political environment that is removing some of the structural impediments at a slower rate than we want, but slowly removing some of the structural impediments. And collectively, that results in inflation coming in lower than the Reserve Bank's expecting. And therefore, there's room for them to cut more. I would hope that they get to the point where they decide to be a bit more front-footed on that, because I think South Africa badly needs to see some growth in the system sooner rather than later. So I think we're hoping for the same thing.
Yeah, I think the area where, in fact, you see the lower interest rates really having their impact is in property. Now, the other thing that, of course, is influenced.
This is right. You have a really crazy pick for the best performing asset class of the year. I think we should end on that. Sandy McGregor, what is your pick for the best performing asset class for the next, I'll give you 18 months, because I think you may need more.
Gauteng housing and property.
Johannesburg property.
Johannesburg
property as the top pick.
Yes. And funny enough, I've said this for the last 6 months as the things are looking at monetary policy, talking about the deflationary effect and interest rates, and therefore rates perhaps can be able to come down. And it's interesting, you're starting to see actually in Johannesburg now, the property market is slowly starting to move. Now, I used to think that this was the thing which would be crazy, but I'm now starting to see that people are starting to buy into that. But I do think lower interest rates would be the place to go. It would be the big changer.
Be the catalyst. Shall we leave it there?
We shall leave it there.
Thank you, Sandy and Nazmeera, for an absolutely fascinating discussion. You managed to cover quite a lot of topics in that.
Well, thank you. It was wonderful to talk to Nazmeera again.
It was great to have the opportunity. Thank you.